It's hard to imagine a time when cider wasn't the readily available beverage that it is now. With hundreds of variants on the market, craft cider has become so popular it's actually affected the sales of wine and beer. Batlow cider launched in 2011 and it's just gone from strength to strength ever since. Co-founded by Sydney-based brothers Rich and Sam Coombs, the company prides itself on being Australian-owned and using only the best Batlow apples. Well, I'm pleased to say we're joined now by Rich Coombs to tell us more about the process of launching Batlow cider. Rich, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. We do appreciate your time. And look, no denying that cider has become such a popular drink now. Just talk us through how Batlow cider began.
Surely, and thanks for having us. Batlow, as you may know, has been growing apples since the late 1800s, but the cider is more of a recent thing. We teamed up with Batlow apples about 7 years ago, and the genesis to that idea was that my brother and I spent a lot of time in London. Our dad lived in London and we spent a lot of time drinking real ale off the hand pump, and we discovered cider while spending time in London and realised it was nothing like it back in Australia. So we were doing different things at the time, and we're having a bit of a Sunday afternoon, sort of barbecue with some friends, and we just couldn't understand why we had such great produce in Australia, but we couldn't actually find any decent craft cider. So that sort of set us on a journey to make our own.
And did you have any experience in beverage production before you decided to launch the brand?
Beverage consumption, absolutely. Beverage production, we hadn't actually had any technical expertise by way of background, so we had to engage some consultants and get some, I guess, help from overseas in particular. Particularly at a time when cider was such a new thing, there wasn't a lot of information floating around, so there was a lot of trial and error and just a lot of learning from, I guess, the grassroots level.
Now, you mentioned Batlow apples there. Why did you pick Batlow as the region?
Growing up in New South Wales, we grew up with Batlow apples as kids, and I guess I couldn't really recall another, strong apple brand that we would be able to partner with. Batlow has about 7% of the Australian apple crop as well, so from a supply perspective, it made sense. But just the Batlow apple brand, they're Australia's favourite apples. They've been growing apples since the late 1800s, and they're probably one of the most iconic names in fruit in Australia. And the timing was pretty interesting. At the same time we approached Batlow with the idea, they were looking at other ways to value add, and they had a 5-year plan to value add along the supply chain as well. So the timing was pretty right.
Yeah, so no doubt you've had pretty strong relationships and connections with those Batlow apple farmers.
Absolutely. Since the get-go, we partnered up financially, and over time, more growers have come on board. So that's a really important part of our story, is that Batlow itself, has a significant ownership of the company, and it also means that all the fruit that we use in our cider making comes from Batlow. We don't use any other fruit. It needs to come within a 30-kilometre radius of the Batlow post office box. So for us, we get control of the product from growing the apples and picking those apples and pressing those apples through to actually making the cider.
Now, how steep was the learning process? You spoke there about the production there of apples and talking us through that's the chain of things, I suppose. How steep was the learning process associated with building up the company?
Yeah, it's pretty significant. I think because cider at the time was dominated by either multinational brands on a grand commercial scale, or it was a very, very small industry. So it was pretty polarized. So the level of information that we had access to in order for us to actually produce cider, and the level of knowledge out there was pretty slim. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of, I guess, a lot of learning along the way, and I think we had access to some good consultants overseas, some knowledge overseas that were pretty excited to see the Australian cider industry here develop, and they were pretty helpful in our journey. So that was super supportive, and we were so appreciative of that. But then you've got the other, I guess, challenges of any startup business, from sales and marketing to distribution.
We mentioned at the top there that the popularity seems to have really affected the sales of beer and wine. Have you been surprised at all by cider's popularity or increasing popularity?
I think when we started, we knew that cider was such a small part of the Australian liquor market that it had to go north from there. But the continued resurgence of cider, it's still the fastest growing segment of the Australian liquor category. So that, I guess, is a surprise. You know, we're 6 years on from our journey, from our start, but we're still seeing strong growth. So that's probably a little bit surprising, but I think you just need to look around and you see cider, you know, popping up in more, you know, festivals, more bars, more pubs, more liquor outlets.
Have you thought about expanding yourselves into other, you know, alcoholic products, beer, for example?
Yeah, so in Batlow, we've started growing hops. So we're about 3 years in. We're in our third harvest of hops. So we received a government grant a couple of years ago to undertake a research study to look at how we could potentially grow hops within the Batlow region. So that led us to Washington in the US and also Nelson, New Zealand, and we found some strong similarities between hop growing and apple growing. So as a result of that, we're now growing hops. And we're also been involved in a relatively new brewery down in Canberra called Capital, which we've helped get off the ground and we're involved in as well. So yeah, definitely on the beer side, there's some strong, I guess, synergies and overlap with the cider.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, look, in terms of, I suppose, the challenges and the opportunities, just talking us through again, I suppose, the process that you've been through, getting, you know, the brand and the company up and running. What have been some of the big wins that you've had with the business, and I suppose with that, perhaps some of the biggest challenges?
Yeah, the wins, on the win side, I think for us, you know, Batlow was a thriving town in the 80s. And we're a strong employer, and then it went through some hardship in the 80s, and since we started Batlow Cider, in particular we do a cider festival every year called the Batlow Cider Fest, and that's on the 3rd Saturday of May, and we get about 11,000 people in the street, and they're all enjoying the town, and for us that's a real celebration of the town. Not just Batlow, but regional communities and the spirit of regional communities. So for us, that's probably the biggest and best thing that we get excited about each year. And our partnership with some, you know, great music productions around the country, and just seeing our cider, you know, grow as part of the craft cider market in Australia. Challenges wise, definitely in the early days, you know, from a production perspective, really dialing in the product to where we want it to be. That was probably the number one thing. And then cider's, you know, cider's such a big market, and there are a lot of mass commercial brands that I guess on a daily basis, you know, craft producers like Batlow and others, you know, there's still a lot of education that we need to, you know, inform consumers about, so that they can make informed decisions and know the difference between a locally produced cider, made with say Batlow apples, and a multinational cider being produced from you know, potentially a Chinese imported Chinese concentrate.
Speaking of challenges, what about running a business with your brother?
Yeah, it has its moments. Definitely don't move in with your brother when you're starting a business. Look, we've always been good mates, and it's been a pleasure sort of doing business with my brother. You know, we're still going strong. I was the best man at his wedding last year. But, you know, I think business is based on trust, and if you can't trust your brother, who can you trust? And, you know, I'm quite fortunate. He comes from a creative background. I came from more of a corporate background, so we complement each other pretty well. So, yeah, we're not a bad team, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, Rich, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Congratulations on the success that you have had so far, and we wish you all the best going forward as well. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Leanne. Cheers.
That was Rich Coombs joining us there from Batlow Apples. Well, that's all we have.